They were smiling, living a peaceful day. But sometimes, peace is just the calm before a life-changing choice. Hello everyone, I hope you're having a wonderful day. Today, we're going to explore a quiet but emotional turning point in Quang and Linda's journey. A moment where love, silence, and an unspoken decision slowly collide beneath a calm surface. And if you enjoy stories like this, don't forget to subscribe to the channel so you won't miss any of our upcoming episodes. The morning arrived quietly, not the kind of morning that announced itself with noise or urgency, but one that slipped in through thin curtains and rested gently on the walls of the house. The light was soft, warm, almost forgiving. It made everything look calmer than it really was. Linda woke first. She lay still for a moment, listening, not to sounds, but to the absence of them. No traffic, no construction noise, no phones ringing, just the steady rhythm of her own breathing. She turned her head slightly. Quang was still asleep beside her. For once, his face was relaxed, no tension in his jaw, no crease between his brows. In sleep, he looked younger, less like a CEO, more like the man she had first fallen for. Quiet, steady, human. Linda watched him longer than she meant to. There was a strange comfort in seeing him like this, as if this version of him existed outside of pressure, outside of responsibility. She wondered how often he allowed himself to rest this way. Truly rest. Carefully, she shifted, placing a hand over her stomach without thinking. The gesture was instinctive, almost unconscious. Then she paused. Her fingers stilled. She didn't smile. She didn't frown. She simply breathed, as if waiting for something she wasn't sure would come. Nothing did. Linda withdrew her hand and slowly sat up. In the kitchen, the house felt different in the daylight. Cleaner, softer, like a place meant for ordinary mornings. She moved slowly, deliberately. Kettle, cup, a small slice of bread. Nothing fancy, nothing rushed. From the corner of the counter, her phone buzzed once. She glanced at it. A message preview lit the screen, then disappeared. Linda didn't pick it up. She poured hot water into the cup and watched the steam rise, thin and fleeting. It reminded her how quickly warmth could vanish if you weren't careful. Behind her, footsteps approached. Quang appeared in the doorway, hair slightly messy, sleeves rolled up. He leaned against the frame, watching her as if he'd been there longer than she realized. "Morning," he said. She turned and smiled, a real one, light, easy. "Morning." He walked over and pressed a kiss to her temple, lingering just a second longer than usual. "You didn't wake me," he said. "You needed the sleep." He shrugged. "So did you." They shared a look, one of those looks that didn't need words. A quiet agreement to let the moment be simple. Quang took the cup from her hand and replaced it with another, already prepared. She hadn't noticed him do it. "Coffee," he said. "The way you like it." Linda raised an eyebrow. "You remembered." "I always remember." She laughed softly and took a sip. For a while they stood there, shoulder to shoulder, sipping their drinks. No phones, no schedules, just the quiet hum of the house settling into the day. It felt normal, almost too normal. Quang broke the silence first. "I took the day off." Linda turned to him, surprised. "You never take days off." He smiled, casual, too casual. "Figured I should start." She studied his face, searching for the tension she knew so well. It wasn't gone, but it was hidden, carefully managed. "You sure?" she asked. He nodded. "Today's just for us." Linda hesitated, then nodded back. "Okay." They spent the morning doing things that didn't matter, and somehow mattered the most. They cooked together, slowly, laughing when Quang nearly burned the toast, arguing gently over whether eggs should be scrambled or fried. Linda won, as she usually did. Music played quietly in the background, something old and familiar. Neither of them remembered who had put it on. At one point, Quang's phone buzzed on the table. Once, twice. Linda noticed. She didn't say anything. Quang glanced at the screen, his smile faltering just for a fraction of a second. Then he turned the phone face down. "I'll deal with it later," he said. She nodded again. Later became a fragile promise neither of them examined too closely. After breakfast, they moved to the living room. Sunlight spilled across the floor, painting soft shapes on the walls. Linda curled up on the couch, a blanket around her shoulders. Quang sat beside her, close but not crowding her space. She rested her head against his chest. For a while, neither spoke. His heartbeat was steady, strong, reassuring. She listened to it the way one listens to the ocean, comforted by its consistency, afraid of what would happen if it ever changed. "You've been quiet," Quang said finally. "So have you." He smiled faintly. "Guess we're even." Linda shifted slightly, adjusting the blanket. "I feel okay today." The word hung between them. Okay. Not great. Not perfect. Just okay. Quang didn't correct her. He didn't celebrate it either. "I'm glad," he said simply. Another vibration from his phone. This time, longer. Quang ignored it. Linda noticed how his body tensed despite his calm expression. "Quang," she said softly. He looked down at her. "Yeah? If one day you have to choose?" She hesitated, then continued. "Don't choose me because you feel sorry." The words surprised them both. Silence followed, thick and heavy, settling into the room like fog. Quang didn't answer right away. He looked ahead, jaw tightening just slightly. Linda lifted her head to see his face. "I don't want to be the reason you stop being who you are." He finally met her gaze. "I'm not choosing you out of pity," he said. His voice was calm but firm. "I'm choosing you because I want to." She searched his eyes as if looking for cracks. "And if wanting me costs you something?" He didn't respond immediately. Instead, he reached for her hand and held it, grounding himself as much as her. "Some things are worth the cost," he said. It wasn't a promise. It wasn't reassurance. It was a truth, and that made it heavier. Linda nodded slowly and leaned back against him. They stayed like that for a long time. Outside, the world continued, calls unanswered, decisions delayed, time moving forward without asking permission. Inside the house, everything remained still, peaceful. But beneath that peace, something unspoken waited, quiet, patient, inevitable. And neither of them said it out loud. The afternoon drifted in slowly, almost reluctantly. The sun had shifted, casting longer shadows across the living room floor. The warmth remained, but it no longer felt effortless. It demanded stillness to be noticed. Linda woke first. She hadn't realized she'd fallen asleep. Her head was still resting against Quang's chest, his arm loosely around her shoulders. His breathing was even, controlled, the kind of calm that suggested he wasn't truly asleep, just paused. She stayed still, afraid that moving might break something fragile. Her eyes followed the line of the window, watching dust float lazily in the light. It was peaceful, almost tender. And yet, beneath that calm, her thoughts were restless. She shifted slightly. Quang stirred immediately. "You okay?" he asked, his voice low. "Yeah," she said. "Just awake." He glanced at the clock on the wall and exhaled. Time moves differently when it's quiet. She smiled faintly. Maybe it's supposed to. They sat up together, the moment naturally loosening its hold on them. Quang stood and stretched, rolling his shoulders as if shaking off something heavier than sleep. "I was thinking," he said, heading toward the kitchen. "We could go out for a bit, somewhere close." Linda hesitated. "You don't have to." "I want to," he said quickly, then softened his tone. "No pressure, just fresh air." She studied him, then nodded. "Okay, but not far." "Deal." They prepared without hurry. Linda chose comfortable clothes. Quang changed into something simple. No suit, no watch. Just a man stepping out of his usual armor. As they reached the door, Quang's phone buzzed again. This time, he froze. Linda noticed the name on the screen before he turned it away. She didn't recognize it, but she recognized the weight behind his reaction. "You can answer it," she said gently. He shook his head. "Not now." She didn't argue, but her eyes lingered on the phone as he slid it into his pocket. Outside, the air was warm and still. The street was quiet, almost empty, as if the city itself had decided to slow down with them. They walked side by side, close enough that their hands brushed occasionally but didn't fully intertwine. Linda spoke first. "Do you ever miss it?" she asked. "Miss what?" "The chaos," she said. "Being needed everywhere. Being unstoppable." Quang let out a small breath. "Sometimes." She nodded. "I think people like you don't know what to do with peace." He glanced at her. "And people like you?" She smiled sadly. "We're afraid it won't last." They stopped at a small cafe near the corner. Nothing special. No one seemed to recognize him, and he seemed relieved by that. They sat outside, sunlight filtering through the trees above. Quang ordered for both of them without asking. Linda didn't mind. It felt familiar, safe. As they waited, Linda watched him carefully. "You've been avoiding something," she said. He didn't pretend not to understand. "You've been noticing." "I always notice." He leaned back in his chair. "It's just work." "That's never just anything with you." A pause. He nodded slowly. "There's a decision coming. One I've been postponing." Linda's fingers tightened around her cup. "Does it involve leaving?" He didn't answer immediately. "It involves choosing," he said finally. She looked down. "You don't have to tell me." "I know." He leaned forward. "But I want you to hear it from me, not from silence." She met his gaze. "There's a project," he continued. "Big, overseas, long-term." Her chest tightened. She kept her voice steady. "And they want you to lead it." "Yes." She swallowed. "And you haven't answered." "No." "Because of me?" He didn't hesitate this time. "Yes." The honesty hit harder than she expected. Linda looked away, eyes tracing the edge of the table. "I never asked you to stay." "I know. And I don't want to be the reason you stop moving forward." He reached across the table, placing his hand over hers. "You're not stopping me," he said. "You're changing how I move." She shook her head slightly. "That sounds like a compromise you'll regret, or one I'll finally understand." Silence stretched between them. Around them, life continued. Cups clinked. A car passed. Someone laughed nearby. Linda stood suddenly. "I need some air." They walked again, slower this time. At a small park nearby, Linda sat on a bench while Quang stood, hands in his pockets. She looked up at him. "If I get worse, will you still say the same things?" His expression tightened. "Don't talk like that." "It's not fear," she said softly. "It's reality." He sat beside her. "I can handle reality." She smiled faintly. "You handle everything. That's That's what scares me. He turned toward her. Linda, I don't want to be the silent weight you carry, she said. The thing you never complain about but always feel. He reached for her face, gentle. You're not a weight. You're the reason I stopped running. Her eyes filled, but she blinked it away. Quang's phone buzzed again. Longer this time. He looked at it. Then, finally, he answered. I'm with her, he said into the phone. Yes, I understand. No, I haven't decided. Linda watched him closely. Give me time, he continued. I'll call you back. He ended the call and turned to her. She didn't ask what was said. Instead, she stood and took his hands. Promise me one thing, she said. Anything. When the time comes, choose honestly, not bravely, not kindly, honestly. He nodded. I promise. They returned home as the sun dipped lower, painting the sky in soft gold. Inside, the house welcomed them back with familiar stillness. Linda leaned against the doorway, watching Quang as he placed his phone on the table. For a brief moment, neither of them moved. The day had been gentle, but the night ahead felt uncertain. Linda stepped closer and rested her head against his shoulder. Outside, the light faded. Inside, the silence deepened. And somewhere between the peace they shared and the choices waiting beyond it, something fragile held on. Quietly,
Xin chào mọi
bravely,
người.
for as long as it
Trong
could.
tập này, Linda và bà Linda theo bà và cậu cháu ra nương mía. Dưới nắng sớm, bà vừa chặt mía vừa kể chuyện ngày xưa. Dậy chặt 3 hoặc 4 khúc cho đẹp để bán được giá. Đồng mía cao dần, 45 đồng trở thành hy vọng cho phiên chợ. Một cây mía đổ bất ngờ khiến cả nhóm kêu, rồi cười xòa vì kịp đỡ nhau. Chiều xuống, Linda buồn bã vì con rúi của mình đã biến mất. Nghi có kẻ trộm rình quanh nhà. CEO Quang ghé đến lắng nghe và trấn an và tự sửa chiếc camera cũ trong kho, kéo dây lắp trước sân nhà để bảo vệ cô. Đêm đến, Linda nấu cơm nếp cẩm mời anh ở lại ăn. Hai người trò chuyện lòng ấm lại. Quang kể áp lực công ty, camera nháy sáng, bóng lạ thoáng qua, và không biết Linda có sống sót qua được đêm nay không. Mọi người nếu thấy video hay, hãy cho mình một like, một subscribe. Cảm ơn mọi người nhé.